The main text of a bill that limits the recognition of indigenous lands in Brazil was approved by the lower house of Congress on May 31. This bill, known as PL 490/2007, has sparked outrage and protests from indigenous groups and human rights advocates, who say it threatens their ancestral rights and the environment. The bill would restrict the demarcation of new indigenous reservations only to land that was occupied by native communities when Brazil passed its constitution, and this means that indigenous peoples who were expelled from their territory before that date, and cannot prove they were involved in an ongoing dispute over their claim, would not be able to secure legal recognition of their lands. The bill would also strip the environment and indigenous people ministries of some powers, weakening their oversight of environmental protections and the demarcation of indigenous lands. The bill would transfer some of these powers to Congress, where the powerful farm lobby has a strong influence. Critics of the bill denounced it as a violation of international standards and a setback for environmentalists and human rights defenders. They argued that the bill would encourage more land grabbing, deforestation, and violence against indigenous peoples, who are already facing increasing threats and attacks from illegal miners, loggers, and ranchers. Indigenous groups from across the country staged protests against the bill in several cities, including São Paulo and Brasilia, where President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva was meeting with other South American leaders. Protesters burned tires, fired arrows, and clashed with riot and military police, who used water cannons and tear gas to disperse them. The bill still requires approval in the Senate and the signature of President Lula, who has promised to repair the damage to the Amazon caused by his predecessor, Jair Bolsonaro. Lula could veto the bill, but Congress could have enough support to override his decision. The bill is also being examined by the Supreme Court, which could rule on its constitutionality. This bill, known as Bill 490/2007, is a serious threat to the rights and traditions of Brazil's indigenous peoples. It would prevent them from obtaining legal recognition of their ancestral lands if they were not physically present there on October 5th, that was the day Brazil's constitution was enacted, or if they had not initiated legal proceedings to claim it by that date. But many indigenous tribes were expelled from their lands during Brazil's military dictatorship, which ended and they hadn't returned to their lands until years later. Without legal recognition, they could be evicted from their territories by land grabbers, miners, loggers, and farmers who want to exploit the natural resources of these areas. According to official data, indigenous peoples in Brazil occupy 13.7% of the national territory, with 610 indigenous lands, of which 487 are demarcated. Most of these lands are located in the Amazon and are considered key buffers against deforestation and climate change. The bill would put these lands at risk of being commercialized and degraded. The bill has been widely condemned by indigenous leaders, human rights groups, environmental organizations, and the Ministry of Indigenous Peoples. They say it violates the Constitution and international treaties that Brazil has signed. They also say it represents a genocide against indigenous peoples and an attack on the environment. The bill was approved by the lower house of Congress on May 31, 2023, with 283 votes in favor and 155 against. It now goes to the Senate for a vote, where it could face strong opposition or be modified. If approved, it will head to the office of President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva to be signed into law or vetoed. Lula has vowed to protect indigenous rights and reverse years of rainforest destruction. He created a new Ministry of Indigenous Peoples in January 2023 and recognized 6 new indigenous territories in April. The Minister of Indigenous Peoples, Sonia Guajajara, has asked Lula to veto the bill in case it reaches his desk. Indigenous groups have staged protests across the country against the bill. They have blocked highways, burned tires, and clashed with police.